What's up, everybody? The next screening of Left at Wall is June 8th in Idlewild, California. That's June 8th, Idlewild, California. We're going to do a short stand-up show, a screening of the film, and a Q&A after with myself and members of the cast. Get tickets and all information at romplacone.com. That's Idlewild, California, June 8th. See you there. Episode 31. Tim Parks. Tim Parks is an author, novelist, and academic. One niche of his, he writes about moving and living in Italy as somebody from a different country. I've read several of his books on that topic, as well as a book he wrote about overcoming a very severe illness that he had. I first became aware of him through several of my former colleagues from grad school and was stoked to talk to him. Please welcome to the show, Tim Parks. So I am familiar with some of your work. You have a very prolific body of work, and I'm certainly not familiar with every single book you've published. But I'm familiar a lot with the Italy side more than anything else. And so to start, I'm just curious, how did you build this very unique, creative life for yourself? I mean, in some ways, you have when people talk about their dream life, it might kind of sound a little bit like yours. I'd love to go write books in Italy. You have, among many other things, done that for quite a long time. So how did you kind of build this, I would say, rather unique creative life for yourself?
Well, it's nice to hear it described like that, Ron. You know, I do hear people saying, you know, oh, Tim Parks' dream life, etc. I can assure you it's never felt like that. Although at the same time, I am sort of grateful that a certain kind of combination of things happened to me. But let me talk you through it as sensibly and rapidly as I can. I was a student of English literature, right? I studied at Cambridge. I went to the USA to ostensibly do a PhD, which I had never any intention of finishing, but it did mean that I got some cash. And really, I just wanted to visit the USA where my brother was already living. When I was in the USA, at one of those parties they used to, I don't know if they still have them, where there's sort of beer in barrels and in
Kegers.
Yeah.
I think they still got them. I mean, I don't know.
It's like a student thing, which to a guy like me was just wonderful. I could just go and fish a couple of beers out of a barrel and talk to people. And, you know, I found myself making eyes with this Italian woman. Okay. So, I mean, that will be a funny story too, because I remember she was introduced to me by a guy across the dorm from me, a guy called Frank Mormando. I think we can name him on the show. And I called him up afterwards and said, Frank, what was the name of that girl, you know? Do you have a phone number? And he said, well, that's my girlfriend. So, you know, I said, fair enough. And then like 5 minutes later, she calls me in the dorm and I say, how did you get my number? And she said, Frank gave it to me. And I'm saying, well, but Frank's your boyfriend, right? And she's, Frank, my boyfriend? Are you joking? And so there you go. That's how the Italian thing started. I met this lady. We married. We went to live in the UK because I was.
Well, wait, time out. What was the actual situation? He said, was she not?
What was the situation? We never understood. He obviously wanted her to be his girlfriend. Uh-oh. He then became a Jesuit. Okay. He actually went to Rome, became a Jesuit. So we don't need to go into that. It was just a kind of introduction into a world where you don't quite know what's going on, as it were.
Okay.
You know, we went to England. We got married. And she was unhappy there and wanted to go back to Italy. I really honestly had no particular desire to go to Italy. I couldn't speak Italian. I was convinced that I was useless at languages. And but she wasn't happy. And at the same time, I was trying to write books and nobody nobody was interested in publishing them. I mean, I must have written about 6 or 7 books before getting published, one way or another, novels. And so, we came over to Italy. I was kind of thinking, well, if I have to underachieve, I'll do it in peace, away from the people saying, you had a great university career, why did you throw it away, sort of thing. So I came over to Italy, and really, I had no intention of writing about Italy. And in fact, I didn't write about Italy for quite a long time, nearly 10 years. I was writing novels, and I finally got published, I think in 1985, yeah. And then, a couple of years later, somebody said, one of the British publishers said, well, why don't you write a book about Italy? There's this guy, there'd been a book called A Year in Provence by Peter Mayle, which had been like this huge success in England. I don't know, in the USA. And they said, why don't you do a book like this? And I looked at the book, and it's about a man who's already very wealthy and goes over and lives in Provence. And it's kind of a humorous, quaint book. And it's very jolly and sort of happy book about having a lot of money in France where it doesn't cost very much. And I just wrote and said, look, guys, I can't do this. Because, I'm living trying to make money in Italy, and it's not an easy country. Things are not so hunky-dory. I can't do this kind of soft book. And they said, sure you can. And they talked about money that I wasn't used to hearing about. And they said, you're never going to make money with your novels. Why don't you at least try this? So, I started that book called Italian Neighbors. I wrote 3 or 4 chapters, and I sent it to them, and they wrote straight back and said, you were right, you can't do this. This is not what we want. And they actually wrote the line, this is not the kind of thing that will encourage middle-class British readers to come over to Italy, And I thought, my mind really rebelled, because what had happened was that I'd been living in Italy for quite a long time. I had sort of got my tongue around the language after a couple of years, and I was sort of growing into the culture. It's a fascinating culture. It's not a culture that reveals itself in 10 minutes. I mean, it's a place where almost everything important is hidden, where you have to struggle even to find the supermarket in your area. It's not got a great big sign outside of it. So I thought, no, this stuff is okay that I'm writing. It's kind of interesting, and I'm interested in it. So I wrote that book, and it was a huge success, to my contentment and surprise. And that was really how it began. I began to sort of alternate doing one of my novels with doing something about Italy, and slowly building up this body of work. And at the same time, rather bizarrely, the New York Review of Books, which I don't think I'd ever even read at the time. Because, in Italy then, it was really quite hard to get foreign publications. I wasn't even reading British newspapers or anything. There was no satellite TV at the time. Mm-hmm. There was to make a phone call was pretty expensive. And we're even pre-fax, And I get this letter from the New York Review of Books, and Bob Silvers in person asked me to do a review of some book about Svevo and Saba and James Joyce in Trieste. And I thought, well, how about that? Somebody must have given my name to the guy. So I did the piece for them, and that was the beginning of really a very long and very happy collaboration. And I just felt that I'd been extremely lucky that I hadn't even looked for this particular work. But one kind of work that I was looking for a lot, when I arrived in Italy to make money, I would teach, and then I got drawn into translating. But I was translating stuff like, I think the first thing I translated was a sales brochure for safes, like for people who want a major safe in their house, you know. And then I would translate stuff from the quarrying industry, because Verona, where I was living, was big on quarrying. I translated a whole manual on a factory for making diesel filters. A Fiat factory for diesel filters, which was going to be built in Zambia or something. That was the kind of stuff I did, and tourist brochures and so on. So I started asking the British publishers if maybe they would let me translate a book, and sort of nothing happened until one fine day I got a phone call, and they said, we have a problem with a book by Moravia, a collection of short stories, and the person who was supposed to do it had found that the stories were too erotic, and they didn't want to be responsible for translating these erotic stories. And they said, we have a publishing deadline, 2 months' time. Can you do this book in 6 weeks? And I just said, sure, of course I can do this book in 6 weeks. And so that's how I got into translating novels then. And after that, for a few years, I was really doing quite a lot of that work. So that's how it all built up. There were these different areas of my life that started sort of coming together in a way that was pleasurable, because then you could write better essays because you were translating. You could translate better because you were reading a lot of literature. Then I started teaching at the university. Everything seemed to feed to the other thing, and it was great.
So you wrote an extensive book about the Medici family, and looking at sort of the world at large. Do you think that we might be hopefully heading towards another renaissance, just as a human species?
What you mean, before we blow ourselves to bits? I don't know. Extensive book. One of the funny things about that book was that it had to be short. It was part of a series of books that had to be, I think, it had to be 50,000 words. In the end, it was 65,000. It's like a 220-page book or something. What was interesting about that really was this sort of negotiation between monetary value and non-monetary value. You have bankers who are making money, but they also want to go to heaven, and they also want to be considered as not just money men, but as men with culture. So that you have that whole thing that happens in the Renaissance where the bankers think if we spend a lot on religious art, the church will accept us, and also we can show that we have taste. We can choose artists who are interesting, and so on and so forth. And I think there was about a century there. Depends which particular place in Europe we're talking about, but there was about a century where I think what was really interesting, the bankers were not cynical. They really did believe in, they really did want to move in. They really did believe, and they didn't want their banking to be merely cynical. At the same time, they were bankers. So it was a fascinating period. I honestly don't see that today. I see a lot of, there are a lot of positive things happening, but I think the world is a much more asphyxiating, difficult place to deal with in some ways now. I don't know any way completely different. It's not a sort of analogy I would think about. What do you think? Do you think money is being intelligently thrown at art today? Or do you think there's a much more speculative? No, I think there's a much more speculative thing. Like, maybe if we invest in this and get people to think that this is the next best thing, we can clean up on it. I mean, that's more what I see. Or I see things like the Arts Council in the UK or the European Union with its various handouts I see them basically choosing on political grounds where they're giving their money. I mean, I don't see anybody who is sort of looking at writers and thinking, "Oh, who's a really good writer? Maybe we could help them if the sales are not making life possible for them." You know, I've been involved choosing or helping to select authors for things like writers' retreats a few times, and one of the things that's increasingly distressing is that the writers, when they send you their CV, the first thing they do is make their political opinions clear, you know, as if that was the issue. Whereas, you know, I don't want to know about their political opinions. I want to see if they can write. But so I honestly don't see this as a period. I see it as a period of decadence, frankly, rather than a happy combination of events as happened in the Renaissance.
Sure. Yeah. No. I try to keep some hope that we're heading towards a better chapter. Kind of like from the Dark Ages came the Renaissance, that sort of thing. But you know, I am hopeful, not necessarily optimistic. As in,
well, yeah. Let me say something on this. I mean, probably I've sounded super negative, but as a person, I tend to be positive. You know, words like optimism, people understand different things by it, or hope. I don't have any particular hopes. I don't say, "Oh, I really hope that, you know, this particular phase." And I just think, let's be positive. You know, let's do what we can. And then when you read, every now and then you find somebody you say, "Hey, this is really, really, really interesting stuff, or really exciting stuff to read." And so every time you read, you read critically, but you always have a kind of half a hope that the guy's going to seduce you and make you see that there's something different, you know, going on. So, yeah, positive.
Well, sure. So I want to talk about one of your specific works now, and it's actually the book that I'm working on right now, Teach Us to Sit Still. What motivated you to document your health struggles in that way?
Well, now we've made a big move, haven't we? Teach us to sit still. Yeah. So okay. You know, I have to. I'm 69. I have to make this sort of effort of replacing, you know, where my head is. We'd been talking about what was going on with Italy, right? I'd explained we arrived in Italy. I was teaching language lessons. I was doing these translations. Gradually, all this got more intense. You know, I was translating quite a lot. I was writing novels. I had started teaching at the university. I was teaching then in Milan. So I was going back and forth from Verona. That's about a 2.5 hour commute. Not every day, obviously, a couple of days a week. I was doing too much stuff, you know? I was doing too much stuff. And I had a family. We had a family. We had 3 kids. It was very busy. Life was too intense. The marriage wasn't always happy. And I began to have all kinds of problems. I began to have all kinds of stomach and abdominal problems, and then peeing problems, peeing too often, and so on, stuff like that. And you know, I had this diagnosis that, you know, that I had an enlarged prostate. Well, I was far too young, it seemed to me, to really be in that position. And when I talked to the doctors about it, they clearly didn't understand why I had all these other issues apart from the peeing. So then that kind of led me into this new place where I had to start spending an awful lot of time looking at medical websites. You know, we were now in internet days, and also gradually beginning to get a sense that my problems had a lot to do with the way I was living. You know. That I was doing too much, but not only that I was doing too much, but like the whole way I was doing it. You know, I was really, in a way I was out on a limb because I was in this small provincial Italian town where more or less nobody knew that I was a writer. I wanted to arrive as a writer, but on the other hand, it's actually quite difficult to arrive as a writer if you're not in the literary scene, as it were, you know. So there was this mix of ambition and work. And, you know, I discovered people are saying, look, what you have is actually due to like hypertension, that you're wired up all the time. You've got to chill out. So I started experimenting with a couple of things, shiatsu, breathing exercises. And somebody finally pushed me to go to a meditation retreat. Now, I should explain that I come from like a super evangelical family, like a family where, you know, my parents, like every conversation deep down was about good and evil. Like you couldn't talk about anybody without him being on our side or on their side. Wow. Right. Which is probably largely why I tend to steer clear of political polemics, you know, because I just had enough polemics as a child. I mean, they were wonderful people, but like everything was seen in these terms. And then they got very heavily into the charismatic movement for a period. So I was living in my teens, like at those very sensitive period, like puberty, between 13 and 17, 18, when I would come home and my parents would be carrying out an exorcism or something, you know, and then people would be shouting. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of funny because in a way we were a very ordinary middle-class Church of England family. And on the other hand, there was this stuff going on, right? So I had built up in late adolescence this total chill out from anything religious or anything that smelled of belief in otherworldliness and stuff like that. So it really took quite a lot for me to be willing to sign up for a retreat. But basically, the guy who did shiatsu for me, and the shiatsu was really quite a revelation. I mean, I was amazed at the change in your body that could be achieved by that, but not only in your body, a state of mind as well. So this guy persuaded me that it would just be an extended exercise in chilling out and breathing exercises, right? So I got involved in that. And I found it totally fascinating. I mean, I didn't buy into the sort of metaphysics of it at all, but I found the whole practice immensely challenging. Like I'd been writing novels where people's minds race, basically, and I'd become actually, you know, like there were critics who said, you know, Parks really captures the way an obsessive mind races along, you know, basically my mind. And the meditation retreats were a place where your mind is kind of fizzing away in nothingness, you know, and you can kind of see the whole pointlessness of a mind that just keeps talking to itself. So I found it fascinating, and that was why, really, apart from the fact that I'd begun to get better after being really quite ill for a couple of years, there were days when I couldn't sit down, you know, when I had to stand up to work. I remember particularly one place where I'd gone to a literary event in Germany. It was a sort of reading and discussion. And, you know, the Germans, they do these things for hours, you know, you go to a reading event in America, it'll last 20 minutes or half an hour. You go to Germany, it'll last like 2 hours. And, I was having to sit down there. It was really, I was nearly dying. I was thinking these pains are unbelievable. I was delighted that I didn't have any, as it were, serious pathology, but I was certainly in pain. So after I started getting better from that and started getting better because of this learning, this whole practice of breathing and staying in a space where the mind is emptied, staying in the present, and learning to think again about one's ambitions and so on and so forth. I thought, this is really too interesting not to write about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if a writer has some kind of God, we're not going to use the word duty, but if a writer has some kind of calling to try and say in an honest way the things that have been important, it seemed important to do this. And the problem, really, the funny thing was, the problem was the word prostate. In the big, I mean, all the doctors had assumed I had a prostate problem. As it turned out, it wasn't that there was the real problem. But it was certainly that there was a problem getting a book published. I mean, it was really interesting. I remember my agent at the time, when I sent him the first chapters, I said, Tim, don't go there, you'll ruin your reputation. And there was a major American editor who I will not name who said, I just get queasy when I see the word prostate. I can't publish a book with the word prostate in. And this was the publisher who was publishing books about, torture in Iraq and stuff like that. It was very, so it was a whole interesting process. And I've noticed that when people tell me not to do a book, those are the books that are going to sell. Strangely,
interesting.
When they tell you not to do it, it's probably going to sell. Yeah.
Well, and that's such a common problem for men. I mean, I feel like that book has and will continue to resonate with so many people.
Listen, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it at the beginning when I went online. It was different going online in those days. Like today things are much more packaged in the social media areas. But at the time, there were much more open sort of chats and chat rooms around. Right. And I found, I remember putting up something like pelvic pain and, you just get millions and millions of hits. And I would spend sleepless nights reading through endless stuff. And then you realize that 70% of men over, 60 or whatever. You can look at the statistics, and how can anybody really know the statistics of this stuff? Because it's not like men are really saying what's going on, and who's registering all this anyway. But anyway, the amount of mail I had after that book actually became a problem, I was just getting too much email. I tell you one interesting thing, though. About a third of the mail came from women who had exactly the same problems, but because they were basically problems of people who are sitting down super tense in front of their computers all day. The pelvic floor gets tense, all kinds of nerves cross the pelvic floor. You start getting referred pain everywhere, basically. But even more interesting, I began to notice that I got lots of mail from people who were translators or people who had changed languages or people who were super stressed by having to work constantly in two languages, because it's certainly a lot of pressure on the mind. Like, when I was teaching for years and years, the university employed me to teach translation into Italian, which is kind of crazy because you have to be Italian to teach into Italian, to translate into Italian. And there I was teaching this. So I had this constant imposter worry.
Mm.
And then I'm teaching in Italian. I have to speak perfectly or near perfectly. Yeah, there was a lot of mental tension going on there. So it was an interesting book to write. Obviously, then what happens when you write a book like that is that they immediately want you to write another. The same thing happened to me with the football book I wrote. They want you to write another, and you say, but I've written everything I got to say about them. That's why I did it. Now I want to move on. I hate to do the same thing twice. So, but yeah, it was an interesting time. I still go to retreats. I go once every year or once every 2 years, and it's still a really important moment for sort of resetting, right? Remembering the things that really count, like being alive, and the things that don't count, like whether you got a good review or, or what the last advance was, and so on and so forth.
So we just talked about sitting down. We're going to switch gears and go to walking now. I wanted to ask you about a book of yours that I listened to, and I believe you were narrating yourself, actually. But
no, what we're talking about, the Garibaldi book
from Rome to Ravenna.
I wasn't me. No, it was a reader.
Okay.
It was a reader.
Okay.
Well, I tell you, it's interesting. You thought that when they do an audio book, they send you kind of samples of guys reading. Mm-hmm. So that you can choose which one you want, And they sent me these people reading. There was one with the kind of BBC plummy voice, and there was one with a sort of very easy, more American voice. And then there was this guy. I just thought this guy has a feeling that really feels a lot like me,
Okay.
So I chose him because it seemed to me that he wasn't over reading it. He wasn't trying to make it sound too plummy and important, or he wasn't trying to make it sound too funny, or he was just reading it. And I liked that. So that's why I chose him. I'm glad you thought it was me, because I've had quite a lot of good feedback about that audiobook, which is a pleasure. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's a really fun, and I'm sure it's great to just read as well, but it's also just really fun to listen to, because then if you're listening to it, you can be walking yourself and kind of just imagining, which is what I did. So, but if you could talk a little bit about the background of that walk, the historical significance of it, and how you got to go on it.
So, okay, so we're sort of weaving together all kinds of aspects of my life here. Let me try and take you right back to the beginning of this. One of the weird things about my life was that I ended up living in Italy, but a couple of, 5 years, 6 years before that, when I was in my last year at school, they had asked us to choose a special subject to do a kind of special project for your final history exam. And I don't know, there were only a few options, like German unification, Italian unification, a couple of other things. And completely at random, I'd chosen Italian unification. And so I'd read about Garibaldi, and I'd read about, Cavour and Vittorio Emanuele and Giuseppe Mazzini. So I'd read about these guys. And when I came to Italy, you realize just how many streets and piazzas are named after these people.
Oh yeah.
And then when I started writing about Italian literature, and like lots of newspapers would think, oh, we've got an Italian book, let's send it to Parks. And so I'd read a lot of books on Italian history, about the Risorgimento. And one of the things that's fascinating in Italy is, like, in Italy, people are constantly telling you, Italy's not really a nation. It's made up of small fragments and they should never have put it together, or they tell you the opposite, But
I feel like you could say that about anywhere.
Right. Well, that's
what I mean?
Like, I suppose the point is that Italy arrived quite late at becoming one of the, like Italy and Germany were the two last formed of the major European nations. So I'd always been fascinated by this question. My wife, my second wife, is from Taranto, which is about, as far south as you can go, down at the bottom of Puglia. Is that really the same country as Milan and Torino and Udine and places like that? And sort of the answer is sort of yes and no, So I'd read a lot about the Risorgimento, and I am fascinated by it because the other thing is we live in a time in Europe now. You probably don't get this feeling much in the USA, but in Europe, with this attempt to construct the European Union, which of course, on the one hand is very idealistic and on the other hand, extremely bureaucratic and opportunistic. But one of the consequences of that has been to constantly downplay the nation state as somehow evil. Like, the Second World War happened because of the nation state. We have to move away from the nation state. But when the nation state was built in 19th century Italy, it was built because the country was fragmented and under the control of other nations. The whole of northern Italy was controlled pretty much by the Austrians. There were the south of Italy was under a Bourbon monarchy, which was not particularly which certainly had no intention of moving towards democracy or anything like that. So there was this feeling that in order to be free, they had to build a single state where people could vote, and if they didn't build a single state, they would always be an object of prey for other nation states. There'd been, there were long periods when France had parts of Italy, when Spain had parts of Italy, and so on and so forth. So it was a hugely ideological movement and full of, it was a liberal movement, the movement for the nation state. It wasn't a conservative movement. So I've always been interested in this. I was reading a book, I don't know, for some review, and I found in a footnote a reference to a diary by a guy called Gustav Hofstetter. Now, this guy, Gustav Hofstetter, was a German army officer who'd been a revolutionary in 1848. You remember that 1848 was the year when there were big liberal revolutions all over Europe. He had escaped from Germany and come down to Rome to help the Italians in their liberal revolution in 1849. And he had fought alongside Garibaldi, who was this sort of great revolutionary hero in Rome against the French in 1849. The revolutionaries, the liberals who wanted a liberal Italian state, had taken over Rome. The Pope, they had wanted the Pope to stay, but the Pope fled. The Pope invited the French and the Spanish and the Neapolitans to recapture Rome. The French arrived in huge force, and after a few months of siege, they finally took the town. And Garibaldi, who didn't want to surrender, escaped with about 4,500 guys. He didn't really know who they were. I mean, they were people who had been fighting in Rome, but he really only had like less than 48 hours to organize this escape. And basically, he tried to cross the whole of Italy from Rome in the sort of central Italy to the west. He tried to arrive in Venice, which is an awful long way, in the hope of supporting another liberal revolution that was going on. So this guy, Gustav Hofstetter, had been Garibaldi's close associate on this on this long and very sad retreat, really. And he'd written this diary. And I managed to find it on the internet. It wasn't available as a book, but I managed to find a sort of facsimile copy. And it's just totally fascinating. And, I was sitting at this very table where I'm sitting now. And I think it was midwinter. And I said to Eleonora, my wife, I said, why don't we take a walk? Why don't we do this walk these guys did? Because it's fascinating, like all the stuff they went through. Because it's so easy to just say, oh, these guys walked 630 kilometers zigzagging across Italy, chased by a French army and 5 Austrian armies. And you think, what? And when did they do that? They did that in July and August when the temperature's high, when it's hard to find water. And you think, like, how committed and mad must have these guys been to do this? And what would it be like kind of walking through parts of Italy that really hardly anybody ever visits and seeing what it's like? I've lived in Italy now 43 years. I mean, then it was like 38 years or something. I just thought, I love to find out more about this country. So we did this walk. We followed the descriptions in the diary, and there are a couple of other diaries, and there are other reports, and there are some archives. And we sort of got a navigation app, which was new for me. We've always walked a lot. And so we did this walk, and we thought it was going to be a holiday, but it kind of turned into a military operation because we wanted to do it in more or less the same time they'd done it, which in the end we managed to do. But it was hard work and it was very hot. We would have to get up at like 5 a.m, so once, twice even earlier, and try and get a lot of walking done before the heat was really too bad. And then you had to find places to stay. Eleonora wasn't up for camping. I would have been up for sleeping rough, but she wasn't up for that. So we had to find places to stay every night. And we were determined not to use any transport at all for the whole distance, which our app at the end told us was 630 kilometers. Wow. So there you go. That is about 400 miles. So we did it, and it was one of the most intense experiences of my life. I guess there was some kind of affinity with the retreats as well, in a way. There's this kind, you get into this, when you're walking really a long way every day, you get into this rhythm of breathing, and also the rhythm of your walking poles with each other, often walking in silence for long periods. It was a wonderful experience. And, although we were not attacked by any Austrian soldiers or indeed by anybody but a couple of dogs, nevertheless, you did feel a kind of, maybe it's romantic, maybe it's sentimental, but you did feel just a sort of human closeness to the sort of existential experience of doing that walk. Obviously, we had better equipment than they did, although we couldn't sort of just walk into a monastery and tell them, guys, stand aside, where's the food? We couldn't do that as they did. But yeah, it was, I think I've got this feeling, which I have very much today, that, we read an awful lot about history, and more when you read about history, you find that historians are like taking sides in a major way, and that they're using the history as a polemic about this and that. I was just eager to go back and say, what did it feel like doing this? And this was, we're talking 1849 in Italy. You're probably talking the last generation of men who had never been on motorized transport, another generation and trains would become a fairly normal phenomenon. So this was all walking and all horses. It was the same world in a way of 1,000 years before, which was just about to disappear at the end of the 19th century. So it was very exciting to do it. And we've done another couple of big walks like that since the book was written. I haven't published about them, but it became a kind of way of spending the summer. So, sort of, it's a bit intense, but it's a lot of fun.
That's an amazing adventure. I mean, long walks are, just one of my favorite things. So yeah, like that's just such a cool. I think just such a cool thing to do.
Where do you walk, right?
Well, I mean, I live near the water in Southern California, so I walk to the beach every day. That's not an epic walk by any means, but I will do that every day, and that's usually when I do a lot of thinking. Usually when I'm walking, I'm a stand-up, so I'll usually think of like material when I'm walking. That's like a habit.
Walking's good for thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because you don't get blocked. Like you have to sit at your desk to do stuff. But funnily enough, it's when you get up and take a walk that then you get the ideas that are sort of the reward for having sat at your desk.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's the way I look at it. I know that if I spend a completely fruitless morning, at some time later in the day, I'll see a way out of the paralysis at some point.
Yeah.
You learn to trust that. I think, what with walking, it's just this feeling also of being in the present moment, of having to pay attention to everything around you, of realizing that yourself is largely made up of the things you're looking at as well. Like you feel different you feel different walking in Milan from walking in the mountains. An awful lot of my writing has really been about the extent to which the individual is absolutely not stable, but in constant negotiation with the people or the places or the language, or so that you never have a character who's just that in a vacuum. Is a person who becomes different things in different spaces. Probably recognizable all the same. Like it's not like personality disappears, but still it changes a lot. And walking's a wonderful. I must say I like walking too when you sit down, you say these two people walked from this town to this town. Like it's not a tourist route or anything. Let's find a path that enables us to do that, mm-hmm. and then it's quite difficult sometimes to actually find a path, but you get this huge feeling of achievement when you manage to walk right from the center of one town to the center. I don't know why you get that. I mean, It doesn't. I can't really explain the reason. You feel you've covered the territory that you've sort of. Maybe there's some pathetic thing about actually having earned your rest at the end of the day, sort of thing. I don't know, but no, it feels good anyway.
So I got to ask you this: you've spent a long time in Italy. You've built this, I think, very unique creative life in Italy. Let's say there's someone out there, maybe they're a comedian and filmmaker and writer. Maybe you're talking to them right now, and they're considering spending the next chapter of their life in Italy. What advice would you give that person?
Well, I'd sit down and talk with them a while, These days, one has to be affirming when people have an aberration. So, one should be. I certainly wouldn't want to put them off. I mean, like in your case, for example, you've got the name Placone. There's presumably Italian parentage, Italian relatives of some kind. So that actually does change the scenario. I mean, it's different from somebody with no connection at all having some kind of romantic sense of what it might be to do this or that. I'd say it's very important if you know or don't know the language, because it's not easy to learn a language, or at least not easy for me.
Parlo un po' italiano, ma non pronto di insegnare in italiano, parlo un po'.
Già qualcosa. I think also it's got more difficult to learn the language because now everybody wants to speak English. Not everybody has a bit of English and they want to speak English to people who speak English. And also because the media is such, we all have our phones, we have the internet, we have everything. So you're always very much in contact with your own language. Whereas I remember when we arrived in Italy, it was 1991, just out of town, Verona. Nobody spoke English, like nobody. And, there was nobody, it was difficult to get books in English, difficult to get newspapers, difficult. You had to speak Italian, basically. Like if you wanted to go out with people, if you wanted to talk, you had to break through. And there was no respite. So I learned. I don't know how easy it would be to learn now. I think I see a lot of people now arriving and basically continuing to live in English, which I think is sad. I think if you're really in a country, it's good to have the language.
Yeah.
I think it's also crucial, Ron, whether you're intending to continue your work life basically in the USA, like basically with things like podcasts or with things like, because then you don't need to engage with a whole very difficult area of Italian life, which is getting work. I think the best book I've written in terms of giving people a really deep sense of what it is to work in Italy is the book called Italian Life. Not a great title. It wasn't the title I wanted, but there it is. It's the title. Because that was the book where I really tried to say, how is it that Italians relate to each other around issues of work and around the whole question of power that work involves, the whole question of money, how does, emotionally as well, how does all that work? Because I think emotions in Italy are different from in the USA and different again from in the UK. Life is not the same in different communities. It's different. But it's quite difficult to put your finger on why it's different and what kind of emotions are going on that are different, the way people feel different. So I looked at that. I do think that getting into work life in Italy is pretty difficult. On the other hand, pretty easy if you have great contacts and they're going to give you a job. I mean, because that is basically how you get a job in Italy. You get a job. But basically, you're talking about a society that is a very modern society, but that still has a very powerful sense of values based on belonging. And by belonging, I mean it matters what your family is. It matters where you come from. It matters if you're in this group or in that group. And the way to get promotion is to be considered a worthy member of this group, not to be better at doing your job than somebody else. That's kind of irrelevant. What matters is this is a guy who's one of us who I can trust, right? Obviously, there are jobs where you do have to be very good at your job. But certainly at the university, what mattered was that you toed the line with this or that group, and you belong to it and accept that you belong and you don't criticize. I mean, there's no word for whistleblower in Italian. Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I mean, let's try since we're talking America. Obviously, in America, it's pretty clear that winning and losing and power are very important, right? the people you admire, people like Bill Gates, people like, all the people who've become major, who've started companies, the whole American dream. You can go from rags to riches. And then when you get to riches, you show that you're also a good person by giving away a lot of money. So you have an awful lot of philanthropy in the USA. You don't have so much of that in Italy. When you have a lot of money in Italy, you make sure that your family are properly looked after, meaning your extended family, all the people who work in your company. Like Berlusconi did not give away vast amounts of money like Bill Gates. But he was an extremely generous person to the people who were part of his group, if you see what I mean. And he was always trying to draw people into his group with gifts, which some people might call corruption. But I mean, this is a habit that goes on from the Medici Bank to the present day. By the same token, you don't see so many people destitute on the streets because they won't let you be destitute. They won't let you fall out of your family because then you bring dishonor on the family if you do that. So you have to be saved. You're not allowed. To fall out of the system in the same way. Like when there's any kind of major disaster or problem in Italy, the first thing they say is nobody will be left alone. That's always the first thing. Nobody will be left alone. So to exclude people is the worst thing you can do to people in Italy. To exclude them from the group. To include them is the best thing you could do. But then there's the whole question of whether this person is a worthy member of the group or an unworthy member of the group. So you get this constantly in Italian novels. They're not about becoming, being successful, getting rich, being good, being evil. They're about negotiating, being inside or outside a family, Or I don't know if you remember, there was huge youth novel success in Italy in, I think it was the late 90s. I might be wrong. It was just called Jack Frusciante è uscito dal gruppo. Okay.
Okay, I'm not familiar. I'll have to look it up.
Right. No, it was hugely successful. Enrico Brizzi. It was published in the USA by, I think it was Grove Press. And they offered me the translation. I said no because it was a youth voice, and I felt I couldn't mimic a youth voice for a US publisher at the time when I was asked to do it. But, there you have a novel with the title, Somebody Has Left the Group. Like, that's like a major thing. People don't leave the group. People don't leave their jobs. Everything's actually quite conservative in Italy. So, you have to get used to it. It's a different world. It's full of also very wonderful things that have to do with that mindset. But like the family restaurants, like the family cafes, which are wonderful. They really are. So there you go. I don't know. I don't advise people anymore. I used to try to advise people. Now I just say, look, if you really, really want to do it, you're probably going to do it. So just plunge in. I mean, just plunge. What else can you do? Work out what contacts you have. Try and be practical and plunge,
Tim, thanks so much for doing this. Where do you want to direct people to go to learn more about you?
About me? Well, they could always go to the website, timparks.com. And then that has links to things like the Twitter, where if I published anything, I stick a link up there. I put up that website. I was, I think, one of the first authors to put up a website. And actually, I did it in HTML millions of years ago. I mean, now it's a pretty primitive website there. And I actually won the author's website of the year when nobody else had a website. So there was no competition. But, I put it up there for exactly what you said. Like, if somebody wants to know the stuff I've done, there's a bibliography, there's an indication of, where I've lived and what I've done. So if they want to interview, they can go and look at that and know a little bit. So that was why I put it up years ago. Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this, Tim.
Ron, it's been fun to talk, really. I hope it's interesting. I don't know. It's okay.
That was Tim Parks. Check out his stuff. You can find his books anywhere. Just type in his name, and I recommend just starting with whatever book sounds most intriguing to you. Music for the 1000 Podcast is provided by Andrew Saxena. Be sure to check out his podcast, the Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I said podcast way too many times in that sentence. Leave us a 5-star review, would you? This is still a new show. Every 5-star review really, really helps. So if you could, wherever you get your podcast, leave us a 5-star review. And if you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can do so over at patreon.com/Ron Placone. For a Give What You Can level, you get bonus podcasts. You get each episode of 1000 before it's released elsewhere. You get screenings of my film. You get full stand-up sets not available anywhere else. It's a really cool community, and that's all for a Give What You Can level. All right, episode 31. We are approaching our third decade, which is still a lot less than 1,000. But here we are. Eventually, there's gonna be more episodes than years of life I have. We're not quite there yet, but we're on our way there. Will I tell everybody when that is? I don't know if I will, but you'll know. You'll know. I'll tell you when we're definitely past. I'll do that. See y'all next week. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1,000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1,000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1,000 is doing for me, and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1,000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1,000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.